This presentation introduces the FIWARE Docker Container Service and describes how you can start using the service. The FIWARE Docker Container Service, FDCS, allows you to manage your Docker containers, volumes, and networks remotely from your local Docker client. You do not have to worry about creating or managing Docker hosts, since the service maintains a cluster of Docker hosts that you can use. Many tenants may share the service's resources, but they are isolated from each other. In this illustration, we show a local Docker client remotely managing its Docker containers from a workstation, but the containers are running on the FDCS cluster. Most of the communication between the client and the service is through the Docker REST API, but the client must get a valid token from FIWARE's OpenStack Keystone Identity Manager service. Once a valid token is obtained, the client can use the Docker CLI or Docker host to create and deploy complex Docker services. The service's tenants share Docker host resources, but are isolated from each other. Refer to this feature as multi-tenant isolation. The service also allows its tenants to use the same names to identify their resources without interfering with each other. Refer to this feature as multi-tenant name scoping. Getting started is simple. The first step is to sign up for a FIWARE Lab account. The second step is to apply for access to the service by sending us an email. The next step is setting up your local Docker client environment to work remotely with the service. Once this is done, you can use the Docker CLI and Docker Compose to transparently manage your Docker resources on the service's cluster. Details on how to accomplish all this follows. Once you have received permission to use the service, you can set up your local environment so that your Docker client can transparently communicate with the service. There are two methods to tell your local Docker client to send its request to the service's URL at dockerlabfireware.org. One way is to export the service's URL to the Docker host environment variable. The other is to reference the URL in each Docker command using the -h flag. Docker config JSON file describes additional headers to include in the Docker REST API sent to a remote Docker service. FDCS requires headers XAuth token and XAuth tenant ID to contain your Keystone token and Keystone tenant ID. By default, config JSON resides in your home Docker directory, but the Docker config flag can be used to override the default directory. We provide a bash script to simplify the creation of the config JSON file called setDockerConf. It requires your Keystone tenant name, username, and password. The input can either be from the environment variables or on the command line. The script interacts with Keystone to get your Keystone token and tenant ID to build the config JSON file. By default, Keystone is set to the FIWARE Identity Manager's URL, so you don't have to worry about that. Also, by default, it generates the config JSON file at Docker's default directory. However, it also provides a D flag to specify another directory. It's best to refresh the config JSON file daily, since Keystone tokens usually expire after a day. You can download the script from the FIWARE Docker's catalog download page. Once you've completed the FDCS's setup on your local Docker client, you're ready to go. You can use your Docker client as usual. To demonstrate, we run Docker run hello world locally, but the container is launched remotely on FDCS's cluster. On the surface, this looks simple, but this is because we have made all the required processing and communication to be transparent. Communication with the service is through REST. The token in your config JSON file is authenticated by Keystone. Its owner must be associated with the config JSON tenant ID. and the token owner must be authorized to use the service. A request will be rejected if the above conditions are not met or the token has expired. Once accepted, the Hello World container is run on one of the Docker hosts in the services cluster. If necessary, container images are pulled from Docker Hub. You can get more information about the FIWARE Docker Container Service at our Read the Docs page or our FIWARE Docker catalog entry.